In the vast expanse of the galaxy where 1,000 civilizations rise and fall like waves upon cosmic shores, there exists a peculiar phenomenon that has puzzled xenoarchaeologists for millennia. Scattered across dozens of worlds, etched into ancient stone tablets, and encoded in the deepest data vaults of long-dead empires, one finds references to a species that should not exist. They call them the Ghost Makers in the old Zephyrian texts. The crystalline archives speak of the ones who burn stars. In the forbidden libraries of the Void Touched, they are known simply as the Impossibles. But perhaps most telling of all is the name found in the emergency protocols of every major galactic government, buried so deep in classified files that even most leaders have forgotten they exist: humanity. For 3,000 years, these references were dismissed as mythology. Ancient civilizations, the scholars reasoned, often created fictional superbeings to explain natural phenomena they couldn't understand. Surely no species could possess the terrifying capabilities described in these texts. No race could be so utterly unpredictable, so dangerously creative, so impossibly stubborn that they would continue fighting even when victory was mathematically impossible. Then, the Devourers came. And suddenly, every government in the galaxy found themselves desperately searching those old archives, hoping against hope that the legends might be true. Because if they weren't, if humanity truly was just a myth created by frightened ancient minds, then the galaxy was about to die. But what happens when legends walk among the living? What happens when myth becomes the only hope for survival? What happens when the galaxy discovers that humanity isn't just real? They're exactly as terrifying as the stories claimed. Some legends are born from fear, others from hope. But the legend of humanity? That was born from something far more dangerous: truth. Ambassador Kethvar had seen many impossible things during her 3 centuries of diplomatic service to the Galactic Council. She had witnessed the birth of artificial stars, negotiated treaties with beings made of pure thought, and once even shared tea with a creature that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. But nothing had prepared her for this moment, standing in the emergency session chamber while holographic displays showed the systematic annihilation of 12-star systems in the span of 6 standard days. The Devourer fleet stretched across the viewing screen like a dark cancer consuming everything in its path. Each vessel was the size of a small moon, their surfaces writhing with organic machinery that pulsed with malevolent life. They had emerged from the void between galaxies without warning, without communication, without mercy. Every attempt at contact had been met with the same response: complete destruction of whoever tried to reach out. Council leader Vorthak's usually pristine blue skin had turned a sickly purple, a clear sign of extreme stress in his species. His 4 eyes darted between the assembled representatives of 63 civilizations, each face reflecting the same growing horror. "The mathematical projections are clear," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of impending doom. "At their current rate of expansion, they will reach the galactic core within 18 standard months. Our combined fleets cannot stop them." The silence that followed was deafening. These were beings who had ruled stars for millennia, whose ancestors had solved the mysteries of faster-than-light travel when most worlds were still cooling from their formation. Yet here they sat, helpless before an enemy that treated their greatest achievements like obstacles to be swept aside. It was then that archivist Moltar, an ancient being whose crystalline form had stood witness to 3 galactic ages, spoke from the shadows where the oldest members always gathered. "There may be another way," he said, his voice like grinding stone. "Though it requires us to accept that our understanding of galactic history is fundamentally flawed." Kethvar watched as every head turned toward the ancient being. Moltar had been old when most of their species were discovering fire. If anyone possessed knowledge that could save them, it would be him. "In the deepest archives," Moltar continued, "in records so old they predate the Council itself, there are references to a species. They are called by many names across many cultures, but the most common translation is humanity. According to these texts, they possessed capabilities that we would consider impossible." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter passed through the chamber. Even in their desperation, the idea of seeking salvation in ancient mythology seemed absurd. But Moltar pressed on, his ageless voice cutting through the skepticism like a blade. "The Zephyrian Codex describes them as beings who could make weapons from their very thoughts and turn the fury of stars into instruments of war. The Void Touched speak of their ability to fight without hope and win without logic. Most telling of all, every single reference describes them with the same phrase: the ones who refuse to yield. Grand Admiral Zixari, whose species had conquered half a galactic arm before joining the Council, leaned forward with obvious interest. Even if such beings existed, she said, her mandibles clicking thoughtfully, these records would be at least 5,000 years old. What civilization lasts that long? That's exactly the question, Malta replied. Because, according to the archives, humanity didn't just survive, they vanished. Every reference to them ends the same way. They departed the galaxy voluntarily, seeking something beyond the edge of known space. But here's what's truly interesting. They left instructions. The chamber erupted in sharp murmurs. Instructions from a mythical species? It sounded like the desperate fantasy of minds unable to accept defeat. But Kefar noticed that even the most skeptical representatives were listening intently. When facing extinction, even myths became worth considering. Moltar activated his personal data display, filling the air with streams of ancient text in dozens of languages. The instructions are remarkably consistent across all cultures that recorded them. They describe a specific stellar phenomenon that occurs roughly every 5,000 years, alignment of pulsars that creates a unique subspace resonance. The next such alignment begins in 72 hours. And what are we supposed to do with this information? Demanded Representative Hicksmith, whose species prided itself on practical thinking. Send a message into space and hope that legendary beings will somehow hear it? Not just a message, Moltar said quietly. A call for help. The instructions are very specific about this. Humanity apparently made a promise before they left. If the galaxy ever faced a threat that could not be defeated by conventional means, if extinction was truly imminent, then their children would return to honor an ancient debt. The word children hung in the air like a physical presence. Every species in the galaxy traced their origins to one of 7 ancestor races that had guided early galactic civilization. But there were always gaps in the archaeological record. Mysteries about how certain species had developed faster than light travel independently, unexplained similarities in fundamental technologies across vastly different cultures. Kethvar felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what Moltar was suggesting. You're saying that humanity is our parent species? That they guided our development and then left us to find our own way? I'm saying the evidence suggests possibilities we've never considered, Moltar replied carefully. But whether they are our ancestors or simply another ancient race, the threat we face leaves us with limited options. We can continue fighting a losing battle with conventional tactics, or we can take a leap of faith and follow instructions left by beings who clearly understood something about warfare that we do not. Grand Admiral Zixahari stood up, her impressive height casting a shadow across the central display. What exactly do these instructions require? Moltar's display shifted, showing star charts and complex mathematical formulas. We need to construct a subspace transmitter at coordinates that will place it directly in the path of the pulsar alignment. The power requirements are enormous. It would require the complete output of a star-class fusion reactor for approximately 6 standard minutes. The message itself is already encoded in the archives, apparently written in mathematical concepts that should be universal. 6 minutes of star-class power output, muttered Chief Engineer Valdrone, his multiple arms calculating rapidly. That would drain the emergency reserves of half our worlds. If this fails, we'll be even more vulnerable than before. If this fails, Council Leader Vorthak said grimly, we'll be dead anyway. At least this way we die having tried everything. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of every representative. All in favor of authorizing the construction of this transmitter? The vote was surprisingly unanimous. When facing extinction, even the most practical minds could embrace desperate hope. But as Kethvar cast her vote, she wondered what they were really summoning. The ancient text described humanity in terms that suggested capabilities beyond anything the current galaxy possessed. If they truly existed, if they actually returned, would they be saviors or simply a different kind of destroyer? The construction began immediately. Every major shipyard in the galaxy was redirected to the project, their massive fabrication systems working around the clock to build something that had never been attempted before. The transmitter took shape in the neutral space between star systems, a massive array of crystalline structures arranged in patterns that seemed to twist space itself around them. As the 72-hour deadline approached, reports continued to arrive about the Devourer advance. They had consumed 6 more star systems, their fleet growing larger with each victory, as they converted captured resources into new vessels. Long-range sensors showed them beginning to target the outer settlements of the Council's core worlds. Kethvar stood in the observation deck of the command station, watching as the final components of the transmitter locked into place. Around her, beings from across the galaxy worked together with desperate efficiency, their usual political divisions forgotten in the face of imminent extinction. If nothing else, she thought, the crisis had brought them together in ways that centuries of diplomacy had failed to achieve. "Pulsar alignment begins in 30 minutes, announced the chief technician, her scaled hands dancing across control surfaces that glowed with alien symbols. All systems show green across the board. The waiting was the worst part. Kethvar found herself staring out at the stars, wondering if they were about to make contact with beings who had shaped the galaxy's development from the shadows, or if they were simply sending an expensive message into the void. The ancient texts were maddeningly vague about what humanity actually was. References to their appearance were contradictory. Their technology was described in metaphors, and their ultimate goals remained completely mysterious. "Beginning power build-up," came the announcement. Throughout the local space, fusion reactors that normally powered entire worlds redirected their output to the transmitter array. The crystalline structures began to glow with energies that made nearby asteroids shimmer like mirages. "Alignment achieved. Broadcasting now." The message that pulsed out into the darkness was unlike anything the galaxy had ever sent. It was mathematics given voice, physics transformed into poetry, the desperate plea of an entire civilization encoded in the fundamental forces that governed reality itself. For 6 endless minutes, the transmitter sang its song of need into the cosmic dark, consuming enough energy to power their civilization for days. Then silence. The technicians ran diagnostics, confirming that the message had been broadcast successfully. But the space around them remained empty, showing no signs that anyone, or anything, had received their call. Hours passed, then days. The Devourers continued their advance, now only weeks away from the outer defense lines of the core worlds. It was nearly a full week later when the first signs appeared. Long-range sensors detected gravitational anomalies near the galactic rim, space-time distortions that suggested something massive was moving between stars. Then came the energy signatures, power readings so intense that most scientists dismissed them as equipment malfunctions. But Kethvar felt a growing certainty that their message had been heard. The question was no longer whether humanity would answer their call. The question was what would emerge from the darkness between stars, and whether the galaxy was prepared for the return of beings whose capabilities had been reduced to legend precisely because they were too terrible for civilized minds to comprehend. As she watched the readings grow stronger each day, Kethvar realized that they were about to discover whether some legends were meant to remain buried in the past, or if desperate times truly could justify awakening forces that had been sleeping between the stars for longer than their civilization had existed. Either way, the galaxy would never be the same. The first human ship to emerge from the dark between galaxies defied every principle of physics the Council thought they understood. It simply appeared in the middle of empty space, without any of the usual gravitational distortions or energy signatures that accompanied faster-than-light travel. One moment the sensors showed nothing but cosmic background radiation, and the next moment something the size of a small asteroid hung motionless against the stars. Captain Zergel of the exploration vessel, Bright Discovery, was the first living being to lay eyes on a human construction in over 5,000 years. Through his ship's main viewer, he stared at something that looked less like a spacecraft and more like a piece of living metal that had been taught to dream. The hull, if it could be called a hull, seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury, while structures that served no identifiable purpose extended and retracted from its surface in patterns that hurt to watch for too long. "Sir," his sensor operator called out, her voice tight with confusion. "I'm reading power levels that shouldn't be possible. The reactor signature suggests an energy output roughly equivalent to a small star. But there's no radiation leakage, no thermal exhaust, no waste products of any kind." Zergel nodded grimly. According to the ancient texts, human technology operated on principles that other species had never mastered. They supposedly treated the fundamental forces of nature not as immutable laws, but as suggestions that could be negotiated with. "Any response to our communications?" "Nothing on standard frequency, sir. But we're detecting some kind of scanning beam. It's unlike anything I've seen. It seems to be examining us at the molecular level, but it's completely passive. I don't think they're learning about our technology so much as learning about us." Before Zergal could respond, every screen on the bridge flickered and displayed the same image. A bipedal figure with pale skin, dark hair, and features that seemed somehow familiar despite being completely alien. When it spoke, the words came in perfect galactic standard, though no human should have known that language. "I am Commander Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Corps vessel, Endurance. We received your call for assistance. Permission to come aboard your ship to assess the situation firsthand." The bridge fell silent. Zergal had prepared for many possibilities, but not for such a direct and immediate response. "Commander Chen," he managed to say, "we would be honored to host you, but our atmospheric requirements may not be compatible with your biology." The human's expression, and Zergal was somehow certain this was what humans looked like, as if the image triggered some deep genetic memory, showed what might have been amusement. "Compatibility won't be an issue. Preparing to transport now." The word transport sent chills through every member of the bridge crew. Teleportation was theoretically possible, but the energy requirements and precision needed made it completely impractical for moving living beings. Yet somehow, Zergal was not surprised when the air in front of the main viewer began to shimmer, reality bending until a solid figure stepped through what had been empty space. Commander Sarah Chen was exactly as tall as the average council citizen, but everything about her presence suggested coiled strength and barely contained energy. Her clothing was simple, a dark uniform with minimal decoration. But the material seemed to absorb light in ways that made it difficult to look at directly. Most unsettling of all were her eyes, which held an intelligence that seemed to see through everything it looked upon. "Captain," she said, extending her hand in what Zergal somehow knew was a greeting gesture. "I apologize for the informal introduction, but time is a factor. We've been monitoring the Devourer advance, and I'm afraid the situation is more serious than your people realize." Zergal cautiously extended his own manipulator appendage to touch her hand, surprised by the warmth and obvious biological nature of her grip. For all their impossible technology, humans were clearly still organic beings. More serious? They've already destroyed 18 star systems. 19 as of this morning, Chen corrected grimly. But that's not the real problem. The Devourers aren't random destroyers. They're scouts for something much larger. Based on their consumption patterns and expansion vectors, we estimate they're preparing the galaxy for invasion by their primary fleet. The blood drained from Zergal's faceplates. Primary fleet? You mean what we've been fighting is just an advanced force? I'm afraid so. The main invasion force consists of approximately 50,000 vessels, each one capable of cracking planets. Chen moved to the tactical display, her hands somehow interfacing with controls that weren't designed for her species. But we didn't come back to watch the galaxy die. We came back to honor our promise. Images flowed across the display, showing the current positions of all Council and Devourer forces. But overlaid on that tactical map were new symbols, red indicators showing the positions of human vessels throughout the galaxy. There were dozens of them, all appearing in strategically critical locations as if they had been planned years in advance. "How many ships did you bring?" asked Commander Veltan, Zergal's tactical officer. Chen's expression became unreadable. "We brought enough. The question is whether your people are prepared for what comes next. Human warfare is different from what the galaxy has experienced. We don't fight to control territory or capture resources. When we fight to win completely." She touched another control, and the display showed detailed schematics of Devourer vessels. But these weren't the rough approximations that Council scientists had managed to piece together. These were complete technical blueprints, down to the molecular level. We know exactly what we're dealing with. The Devourers are a hive mind species that consumed their home galaxy approximately 8 million years ago. They've been wandering the void ever since, moving from galaxy to galaxy like parasites. How do you know all this?" Zergal asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Because we've fought them before," Chen replied simply. 3 times, actually. They've tried to enter this galaxy twice in the past, but we stopped them at the galactic rim. This time, they found a way to slip past our perimeter defenses. But that just means we get to demonstrate why most species prefer not to engage humans in warfare. The casual way she spoke about fighting in force that had brought the galaxy to its knees was perhaps more unsettling than anything else. Zergal studied the human woman more carefully, noting the way she moved with perfect economy of motion, the way her eyes constantly tracked potential threats and escape routes, the subtle confidence that suggested she had never encountered a problem she couldn't solve through sufficient application of violence. "What do you need from us?" he asked finally. "Right now, just stay out of our way," Chen said. "I know that's difficult for species accustomed to being in control, but human tactics require absolute coordination. Any interference, even well-intentioned assistance, could compromise the entire operation." Before Zergal could object to being relegated to the role of bystander, alarms began sounding throughout his ship. The sensor operator's voice cut through the noise. "Sir, massive gravitational disturbances throughout the system. Something big is coming through hyperspace." Chen nodded as if she had been expecting this. The Devourers detected our arrival. They're sending everything they have in this sector to stop us before we can establish a beachhead. She turned to face the main viewer, and for a moment her human facade slipped, revealing something ancient and terrible beneath. Perfect. It's been too long since we had a proper fight. Space around them began to fill with emerging Devourer vessels. Dozens, then hundreds of the massive bioships tore through the fabric of reality, their organic hulls pulsing with malevolent life. Each one was a nightmare of evolved destruction, covered in weapons that could sterilize planets, and protected by shields that had deflected every attack the Council had ever attempted. Against this armada stood a single human ship, still hanging motionless in space like a piece of impossible art. "Commander," Zergal said urgently, "you need to call for reinforcements. One ship cannot possibly." He was cut off as the human vessel suddenly moved. Not accelerated, not maneuvered, simply moved from one location to another, as if space itself was rearranging to accommodate its desires. Where it had been empty space, where it was now hung surrounded by the twisted wreckage of 6 Devourer vessels that had somehow been completely destroyed in the instant of the ship's relocation. "The Endurance doesn't need reinforcements," Chen said calmly as explosions bloomed across the tactical display. "She has everything she needs." What followed was not a battle in any sense that Zergal understood. The human ship moved through the Devourer fleet like a force of nature, appearing and disappearing at will, leaving destruction in its wake that defied comprehension. Weapons that had never been fired somehow struck targets with perfect precision. Devourer vessels that had withstood concentrated bombardment from entire fleets simply came apart at the molecular level. In less than 10 minutes, an armada that could have conquered star systems was reduced to expanding clouds of debris. Throughout it all, the Endurance never fired a visible shot, never showed any external weapons, never even seemed to be trying particularly hard. It was as if the universe itself was offended by the presence of the Devourers and had decided to correct the situation. "How?" Zergal whispered, staring at the empty space where an invasion fleet had been only minutes before. Chen turned back to face him, and once again she was simply a woman in a dark uniform, showing no signs that anything unusual had just occurred. "Humans have been fighting wars since before we learned to make fire," she said. "We've had a long time to get good at it. But this was just a skirmish. The real fighting starts when their main force arrives." She moved toward the center of the bridge, and reality bent around her again as she prepared to transport back to her ship. "Captain, I need you to relay a message to the Galactic Council. Tell them that humanity has returned, and that the age of defensive warfare is over. We're going to take this fight to the enemy, and we're going to end it permanently." "What about the main invasion force?" Veltarn asked. 50,000 ships, you said. Chen's smile was the most frightening thing Zergal had ever seen. 50,000 ships sounds like a good start, she said. It's been a while since we had target practice. As she began to fade from view, her final words echoed through the bridge. "Oh, and Captain, you might want to establish emergency shelters on all Council worlds. When we go to war, the entire galaxy tends to shake." Then she was gone, leaving behind only the scent of ozone and the growing realization that the galaxy's children had returned home, and they were very, very angry about what had been done in their absence. Zergal stared out at the human ship, which had already begun moving toward the next Devourer concentration, and wondered if they had called for salvation, or accidentally summoned something far more dangerous than what they had been trying to escape. Either way, he suspected that the galaxy was about to witness warfare on a scale that had not been seen since the days when humans walked among the stars as gods. 3 days after first contact, the Devourer main fleet arrived at the galactic rim with the force of a collapsing universe. Ambassador Kethvar watched from the emergency command center on Nexus Prime as long-range sensors detected gravitational anomalies so massive they temporarily disrupted faster-than-light communications across half the galaxy. When the static finally cleared and the sensors recalibrated, the reading showed something that made even hardened military officers question their sanity. 53,000 vessels hung in the void between galaxies, each one a living nightmare of evolved destruction. The smallest ships were the size of moons, while the largest command vessels dwarfed entire star systems. They moved through space like a plague of metal locusts, their biomechanical hulls pulsing with the absorbed life force of dozens of consumed galaxies. But what truly terrified the assembled council leaders was the precision of their formation. This was not a barbaric horde seeking random destruction. This was a military operation conducted by an intelligence that had perfected the art of galactic conquest over millions of years. They spread out in a perfect sphere, creating an unbreachable blockade around the entire galaxy while smaller forces moved inward to establish staging areas. Estimated time until they reach the outer colonies? Asked Council Leader Vorthak, his four eyes fixed on the tactical display with desperate intensity.
Grand Admiral Zixari consulted her tactical computers, her mandibles clicking in a rhythm that indicated extreme stress.
At their current rate of advancement, 6 standard days, our entire combined fleet might delay them by perhaps 8 hours. The silence that followed was broken by an aide rushing into the chamber with news that sent chills through everyone present. Sirs, we've lost contact with the human vessels. All of them. They were there one moment, and the next moment our sensors couldn't find any trace of them. Kefar felt her heart sink. Had humanity taken one look at the true scale of the invasion and decided the galaxy was already lost? Had they abandoned their children to face extinction alone? The ancient texts spoke of human determination and refusal to yield, but perhaps even they had limits when faced with impossible odds. It was then that the communication arrays across the galaxy received a simultaneous broadcast on every frequency, in every language, carrying a message that would be remembered long after the last star burned cold. The voice was Commander Chen's, but amplified somehow to reach every inhabited world simultaneously. Citizens of the galaxy, the message began. This is Commander Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Corps speaking for all of humanity. We have returned to honor an ancient promise, and we will not allow our children to face extinction while we still draw breath. What you are about to witness is the true nature of human warfare. We do not fight for territory or resources. We fight for each other, and we fight to win. The transmission paused, and when it resumed, Chen's voice carried undertones that seemed to vibrate through the fabric of space itself. To the Devourer command structure, if you possess the intelligence to understand this message, you have made a critical error in judgment. You believed this galaxy was defenseless because you saw no human vessels in our old territories. You assumed we had grown weak or extinct during our absence. You were wrong. Across the galaxy, every sensor array, every astronomical observatory, every personal viewing device capable of detecting electromagnetic radiation suddenly registered the same impossible reading. The space between stars was beginning to glow.
We did not leave the galaxy because we were driven out, Chen continued.
We left because we had learned to wage war on scales that made galaxies uninhabitable. For 5,000 years, we have been building weapons in the dark between galaxies, preparing for the day when extinction-level threats would require extinction-level responses. Kethvar rushed to the command center's main observation deck, joining hundreds of other beings who stared in shock at the night sky. Stars that had shone with steady light for millions of years were beginning to flicker and pulse in perfect synchronization, as if the entire galaxy had become a single, massive instrument. What you see now is the activation of the Starfire Protocol, Chen's voice explained as space itself seemed to catch fire around them. Every star in this galaxy has been prepared over millennia to serve as both weapon and shield. Every planet, every asteroid, every particle of cosmic dust has been quietly modified to respond to human commands. The tactical displays in the command center erupted with readings that defied comprehension. Energy signatures were appearing throughout the galaxy, not from ships or stations, but from the stars themselves. Solar output was increasing across thousands of systems as stellar cores were somehow convinced to burn brighter and hotter than physics should allow. But the true scope of human preparation became clear when the first Devourer vessels attempted to enter the galaxy proper. As they crossed the invisible boundary that marked the galactic rim, space around them simply changed. The vacuum itself became hostile, exotic particles materializing from nowhere to tear at their hulls, while gravitational fields strong enough to bend light into pretzels appeared and disappeared with surgical precision. For 5,000 years, Chen continued, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the modified stellar frequencies. We have been turning this entire galaxy into the largest weapon ever conceived. Not a weapon to destroy worlds, but a weapon to protect them. Every star is a gun, every planet a shield, every asteroid a guided missile waiting for our command. Admiral Zixari stared at her tactical displays with an expression of dawning horror. They didn't leave the galaxy, she whispered. They became the galaxy. The Devourer fleets advanced ground to a halt as they encountered resistance unlike anything in their millions of years of conquest. Ships that had survived the destruction of entire civilizations found their hulls dissolving under assault from modified cosmic radiation. Vessels protected by shields that could deflect the output of supernovas discovered that space itself was now their enemy, with gravity wells and temporal distortions appearing wherever they tried to establish positions. But humanity was far from finished. As the Devourers struggled to understand how empty space could be fighting back, the real human fleet finally revealed itself. They emerged not from hyperspace or from hiding behind planets, but from the stars themselves. Vessels that looked like living light poured out of solar cores, their hulls forged from materials that existed only in the heart of fusion reactions. Each human ship moved with purpose that transcended mere technology. They flowed through space like thoughts made manifest, appearing where they were needed without regard for the normal limitations of distance or time. When they fired their weapons, if weapons was even the correct term, entire Devourer formations simply ceased to exist. Their matter converted into energy and redirected to fuel the galaxy's defensive systems. The Devourers are masters of consumption, Chen's voice explained as the battle raged on scales that dwarfed entire star systems. They have evolved to digest galaxies the way other species consume individual meals. But they made one fundamental error. They assumed that intelligence and technology were separate from the environments that created them. Kethvar watched in amazement as human tactics became clear. They weren't fighting the Devourers ship to ship or even fleet to fleet. They were fighting them galaxy to galaxy, using the entire stellar structure as a single, coordinated weapon system. Stars went nova on command, their explosions channeled and directed like artillery shells. Planets moved out of their orbits to serve as shields or projectiles. Even black holes were apparently under human control, their gravitational fields manipulated to create inescapable traps for enemy vessels. The Devourer command structure, an intelligence that had conquered dozens of galaxies through patient planning and overwhelming force, found itself facing an enemy that had spent millennia preparing for this exact moment. Every strategy they attempted was countered before they could implement it. Every advance was met with resistance that seemed to anticipate their moves. It was as if they were fighting an enemy that existed in several dimensions simultaneously and could see every possible outcome of the battle. We are not the same species that left 5,000 years ago. Chen's broadcast continued as human vessels began systematically dismantling the invasion fleet. We have learned to think on cosmic scales, to plan in geological time, to wage war with the fundamental forces of nature itself. We do not merely use technology, we have become technology. The turning point came when the Devourers attempted their final gambit, converting their entire fleet into a single massive organism that could consume the galaxy's core in one devastating assault. It was a tactic that had never failed, requiring them to sacrifice individual vessels in exchange for creating something large enough to eat star systems whole. The humans let them do it. As the massive bioconstruct took shape, growing larger than anything that had ever existed in known space, human forces seemed to retreat, withdrawing to defensive positions around key star systems. For a brief moment it appeared that even humanity might be overwhelmed by such raw, destructive power. Then, the stars began to sing. Every modified star in the galaxy suddenly synchronized their output, creating a resonance frequency that turned the entire galactic structure into a single, massive tuning fork. The bioconstruct, despite its incredible size and power, found itself vibrating apart at the molecular level as the galaxy itself rejected its presence. But humanity wasn't satisfied with simply defeating the invasion. As the Devourer construct dissolved into component particles, human vessels began a systematic pursuit of every fleeing enemy ship, not to destroy them, but to follow them back to wherever they came from. The age of defensive warfare is over, Chen announced as the last Devourer vessel was either destroyed or driven beyond the galactic rim. We will not wait for extinction-level threats to come to us. We will find them in the darkness between galaxies and end them before they can threaten anyone else. In the command center on Nexus Prime, the assembled leaders of galactic civilizations sat in stunned silence as they tried to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The humans had not simply won a battle, they had demonstrated capabilities that redefined what was possible. They had turned an entire galaxy into a weapon, manipulated the fundamental forces of nature like tools, and fought a war on scales that made traditional concepts of military power completely obsolete. "What happens now?" asked Council Leader Vorthak, his voice barely above a whisper. As if in answer to his question, Commander Chen materialized in the center of the chamber, though this time her appearance was different. She seemed more solid somehow, as if she existed more completely than the beings around her. When she spoke, her words carried harmonics that suggested she was somehow connected to every star in the galaxy. "Now," she said with a smile that contained both warmth and terrible authority, "we rebuild. The galaxy has been scarred by this invasion, and there is much work to be done. But you will not face these challenges alone." She gestured, and holographic displays showed human vessels moving throughout the galaxy, not as conquerors but as healers. They were already beginning the work of repairing damaged worlds, restoring devastated ecosystems, and helping refugee populations return to their homes. Humanity never abandoned you, Chen continued. We simply learned that the best way to protect our children was to become something greater than any single threat they might face. For 5,000 years, we have been the guardians in the darkness, keeping watch while you grew and prospered. Kethvar found her voice at last. And now, will you stay or will you return to the dark between galaxies? Chen's expression became thoughtful. That depends on you. We can continue to watch from the shadows, intervening only when extinction-level threats emerge. Or we can step into the light and take our place as part of the galactic community once again. Her smile widened slightly. Though I should warn you, living with humans as neighbors is considerably more complicated than having us as distant guardians. The vote was unanimous. Whatever challenges might come from coexisting with beings who could use stars as weapons and manipulate the fabric of space-time itself, it had to be better than facing the universe's dangers alone. As the emergency session concluded and representatives began making plans for a new era of galactic civilization, Kethvar lingered on the observation deck, staring up at stars that no longer seemed quite so distant or cold. Somewhere among those lights, human minds were already at work planning for the next threat, the next challenge, the next impossible problem that would require impossible solutions. The galaxy's children had finally met their parents and discovered that some family reunions were worth waiting 5,000 years to experience. But perhaps more importantly, they had learned that the universe's darkness held no terrors that could not be answered by beings willing to transform themselves into living weapons in defense of those they loved. Humanity had kept their promise. They had returned when extinction seemed certain, and they had won a war that should have been impossible to win. But most remarkably of all, they had done it not as conquerors seeking to reclaim lost territory, but as parents protecting their children from nightmares too terrible for young civilizations to face alone. The legend had become reality. And reality, it turned out, was far more extraordinary than any myth could ever be.